Welcome to Supply Chain Next with your host, Richard Donaldson. Join us as we explore the ongoing evolution of supply chain, from the challenges professionals face every day to the ongoing digital transformation of the entire value network.
And welcome to the next episode of Supply Chain Next. And I am thrilled to have a friend and colleague, although virtual, I shall say, of Jason Murray. And we were just before the show chatting up and realizing we hadn't spoken in a couple of years. So Jason, welcome to the show. And thanks for joining us this morning.
It is great to be here. Thanks for having me. At some point, we got to find some way to meet in person too. So this is awesome.
I still feel like all this virtual remote stuff, it's still sinking into people. They're like, oh my God, I've known someone for 2 or 3 or 4 years, but I've never actually met them in person. Yeah. And that's all too common now.
Yeah, Richard could be like 7 feet tall as far as I know. So,
yeah. So all right. So let's just kick it right off. As I always like to kind of start with a little bit of an origin story on, who Jason Murray is. And, you've had a pretty interesting career, although I will also say fairly focused. And I'd love to hear from yourself about just kind of how you got started, what launched you into, becoming, getting to Shipium, but what got you even into supply chain and procurement? I mean, that's a pretty odd thing to get into.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just kind of walk you through the story, but I was at Amazon almost 19 years. Actually 19 years. I was going to say almost 20 years. I started there in 1999, and when I came over, I was actually a software developer. So I came over as I was working on kind of compiler and operating systems type classic computer science stuff that everyone did back in the late 90s, and came over to Amazon.
And this isn't sorry to interrupt, but this is in Washington, right? You've been sort of in Redmond the whole time, or thereabouts, kind of the Washington area.
Yeah, I live on the. If you know the Seattle area, I live on the east side. Amazon is, Microsoft's kind of in the east side.
The Redmond.
Amazon's Redmond, Bellevue area. And then Amazon has always been kind of in Seattle. And so anyway, started at Amazon in 1999. And I went into the space that was essentially the fulfillment center system space. So what we were doing at that point in time was we were developing the software that essentially runs the fulfillment centers. And so kind of what's happening in the building. And, in those days, that was really the entire focus of Amazon and logistics. Like there was kind of no notion of like how we're doing procurement. That was all kind of done manually by the retail teams and stuff. But it was how to make those buildings flow, how to make the buildings run efficiently. And the challenge in those days was just that the kind of way you do single piece flow e-commerce was not really figured out. And I think if I go to fulfillment centers now, it's pretty, it looks pretty similar like it did back in the early 2000s at Amazon. But this whole concept of kind of how do you flow goods from through the fulfillment center in terms of pick and sort and then pack and how and make kind of break the constraints in those processes. And I just honestly, the reason I'm going so deep into this is I just fell in love with this kind of concept of using software to kind of do physical things. Right? It was if you go back in time. And to that period of time, most software people were doing things like Microsoft Office or working on operating systems, and kind of we were working on these really physical things. And I just thought this is the coolest thing ever. And
I'm going to jump in for a second, Jason, because again, I think you've lived this. This is your origin story.
Yeah.
But at the same time, to level set for the audience, I mean, if I remember correctly, so here we are in 1999. You're coming over as a software engineer. If I'm not mistaken, Bezos had just kind of sort of launched Amazon. I mean, Amazon was only were we about 96, 97, or 97, 98, if I remember correctly? So it was kind of an embryonic company at the time. And what employee number were you?
It's tough at Amazon because they have the warehouse associates. And so there's always, quite a few. I think it was in that period of time, though, the actual kind of group of the IT corporate people, it was a couple hundred. It was tiny, right?
Right. And that's kind of my point, which is also, even though and we're going to get to this, and I want you to expand on it because I can see the eyes light up, and we're getting into the big back and all that sort of stuff and how that grows in. But I also think I don't want you to overlook the fact that your experience at that time is one, Amazon, for all the external views of Amazon, it was a book selling platform, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But you were under the covers beginning to build the infrastructure that led to becoming Amazon, the e-commerce giant, right?
Yes.
So were you aware at that time of strategically what was going on, right? Because you could have been just a kid in the candy store, but now looking back on that, you were at a really interesting juncture where, this is people always go, how did Jeff Bezos go from book selling to this e-commerce giant? You were right in the middle of it, literally.
Yeah, no, that's right. And what I remember was just all of this difficulty around, books had this SKU model, and they had list prices, and it was kind of this pretty easy thing to display. And what we were trying to figure out at the time is how do you kind of receive toys into the warehouse, right? Because it's like comes in multi-parts. It's these weird, things that you combine together that are made for storefronts. And that was kind of the work that was happening. And then on top of that, it was just all of the fulfillment processes has kind of been built around books, right? Books are very uniform in size. And I don't even know if Bezos himself realized what a genius thing it was to focus on books initially, just because of the kind of the fulfillment requirements, right?
Right.
And even more to the point, not going in the rabbit hole even further, right? A lot of the software that was built we already had legacy software in the fulfillment centers because it was built for this model where they were running out of his garage and receiving books, putting them in bins, and then which essentially acted as the sort to the person receiving it. You get the book from the distributor, you put it in the bin of where it's going, and that ends up shipping off to the person. And it because it was kind of this indirect mail order thing when it started. And so we had a bunch of stuff in the software, the way the fulfillment center software that was kind of linked to that, right? So it was kind of untangling that as well. So, but no, it was. I think you're right on the money that you were starting to see us kind of shift towards new product types, and I think there was already some early rumblings that kind of we were going to move towards, we were going to move away from books and into these other things. I think the first couple categories were obviously the other media categories, which, for the younger podcast listeners, we used to have to put physical discs in machines to watch movies. Books still remain, but anyway.
How archaic. Oh my God. Right? God forbid we talk about 8-track tape or something like that. Jesus, right?
Yeah. But we had, we basically, it was kind of shifting towards toys, and I think they had started putting some kitchen stuff on the site. And, they all had challenges in terms of bringing it in. It was becoming really clear. Bezos, I think, had already kind of locked into this, essentially borrowing from Walmart, which was you kind of selection is going to be this huge driver in e-commerce. And it started with these super centers where you have 100,000 items, but e-commerce kind of the first pass of e-commerce. The amazing thing about it, before we talked about fast shipping or sharp prices or all the other stuff that's going on now, but it was all about selection. And that was what e-commerce was going to drive. And I think you had this opportunity to basically show people millions of items, which was totally novel at the time, right? That was just crazy to give people access to that kind of selection. And it didn't necessarily mean that I think the 80-20 rule around retail was not really in play in those days, because people were buying into the tail, and you're really starting to see that shift from a consumer standpoint, that I could go online and find anything. But my point of all this is it was building the fulfillment infrastructure that could handle that. And that was really exciting from a career arc perspective.
And again, as you're going to launch into kind of the progression here, give you a breather for a second. And as you kind of look then, so you kind of come in at 99 and you're just at the beginning to start this 20-year career at, again, household name, Amazon, right? You're also at the formative juncture of what I would begin to say was the digitization of the actual supply chain. Because it was one thing to conquer e-commerce as a front end, UI or UX, experience, right? That's the easy part.
Yeah.
What you were tackling was the middle part, because we're not getting to manufacturing yet. I'm going to leave that as an open item for the end. But in the middle is now, how do I get things from A to B? How do I move a product from A to B? And that to me feels like the early transformative beginnings of what we're seeing now kind of migrate through 22 years later, the digitization of the entire world supply chain. So you were at the very beginning stages of that digital transformation. You began to carry it through in your career at Amazon, knowingly or unknowingly. You were stepping into what brought you to Shipium, but at the same time, you were solving probably one of the biggest problems that the digitization of the supply chain needed to solve. Yes. So now, as you kind of carry through your career, I guess my very specific question is, and this is sort of what do you think now, looking back on it, was the key to success in digitizing that logistics piece, right? Like, what elements do you think you uncovered and developed and learned through these 20 years? And please go through that. But I mean, to me, I feel like there's like a nugget of wisdom in there around what you uncovered that is going to migrate to all of the supply chain.
So I actually think that's a great question. To some degree, I almost feel like you're kind of teeing me up, but I'll take it. I'll take the layup, right? Like the thing that I think was the most interesting about kind of how Amazon approached logistics, fulfillment, supply chain in general was basically the customer-facing notion of it. And I don't know if some of this was conscious, and this is not, some of these are not a new concepts, but some of it was more of the practicality of kind of, you really have to solve up the stream back from the customer to get this stuff right. Because if you're not anchored on what people need ultimately, what's driving the supply chain, which I think is ultimately people in retail. It's sales and people buying stuff and the convenience attached to it. And I think what's interesting about e-commerce is those problems and those things that you're not able to hide it like you are in a store, right? People get exposed to what your supply chain looks like, whether you like it or not. And it shows up as things like, slow shipping or not being delivered when it was supposed to be, or you're not being able to tell them when it's going to be delivered. All those are factors, right? But I think what Amazon was doing, and by working in the fulfillment centers to start, is we were getting the part right around this like, let's figure out what the consumer needs, and then I'm going to essentially pull the rest of the supply chain towards that over time. And my biggest thing, even with Shipium now, is getting companies or people to frame things in terms of that context, right? Who are you serving with the supply chain? And it's ultimately the customer. And if you're not laser focused on that, then you're kind of focused on the wrong thing ultimately. And I think it's so easy to get lost. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but when you start talking about supply and ocean freight and everything that's happening there, if you don't anchor it on why you're pulling this stuff over to ultimately to sell it to this end customer, then you lost something, right? And it ends up, what happens is it turns into, how do I get more stuff shipped across the ocean for cheaper? Like, I can get a whole container of this and then my unit cost is cheaper. But if no one buys it, then you haven't saved any money, right? And this is kind of the problem with thinking about it kind of at this individual component part. And so this systematic thinking and really anchoring it in the e-commerce, e-commerce lets you attach that transaction directly to when the customer receives it at the door. And then you kind of pull everything back from that. So that was a lot, but I think in general, that's the theme. That's the theme that dominated my career. And I had the virtue of kind of going up the supply chain, or starting all the way at the customer when you're in the fulfillment center, putting, stuff in boxes that people are going to get, and then moving up the supply chain over time to kind of where things are now. So anyway.
Well, let's dive into that, because I think that, number one, obviously great perspective. And I think this is, again, we might even be in the early stages of developing the academia that supply chain will be taught on over the next 10 or 20 years is these lessons. You know what I mean? That's sort of the essence of the question is like, what the hell did you guys figure out as you're going? Right. Because a lot of it was just trial and error. Case in point, AWS. That's my kind of world, right? The whole data center world. And, I know for a fact, Amazon wasn't intending to be a cloud services provider, but it's like, holy shit, we built all this infrastructure. God damn it, let's rent it out, right? So, you were solving problems you needed to do your core business. And in this case, you got the e-commerce site set up, you could sell books, and realized, oh, I could sell anything. And then you get in and start tackling kind of, okay, the middle part of the problem, again, the manufacturing side, which is how do I get the stuff from A to B? How do I move it? How do I transport it? How do I make that efficient? How do I make that economical? How do I automate that? So you're building all of the, and as you said quite eloquently, you have to focus on the demand side, right? The ultimate problem you're solving for is when I look at the current, and this is the number that's out there, $100 trillion global market, right? How do I tap into the demand signals to assure what I'm manufacturing, building, and delivering in an efficient way, right? Because the more I know about those aggregate demand signals, the more efficient I can make the supply chain, I guess is another way of kind of doing it. But I want to double click one more in there, which is there's also some fundamental technology building blocks. So I'm kind of now teeing up a little bit of the geek side, right? Which is there's the consumer demand side, that's the business side. But then underneath it in logistics, you must have solved some pretty cool shit over the last 20 years on how technically, right, to accomplish that. And my suspicion here is there's a data model hidden under there that probably has to, there's the whole structured data thing, which is also an interesting anecdote, right? Because I was at eBay for 5 years. So one of the things that eBay did really horrifically at the beginning was they had no unstructured data. Amazon comes along, right? And lesson learned from eBay, structure your data up front, right? Which is why this is why you can find things on Amazon and you can't find it in eBay. And I'm not saying anything, that no one doesn't know, but that's exactly the underlying reason, right? Yeah. So same thing here. You guys started building you started thinking of some data models around logistics that ultimately now looking back on are probably pretty unique and fundamental for other people who are now trying to digitize logistics. What might have those been?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the part of it is I have this kind of framework in my head where I think there's always this, and I think of it more or less as a loop, right? Like kind of a constant loop that's changing. And I think one of the things that you have to kind of think about when you're building these processes, and I'm so like down the rabbit hole at this point. Maybe it's applicable to something else, but I know it's applicable to this. So we'll start here. But I think, sometimes the issue is jumping ahead. And the three stages I kind of think about are measurement, automation, and then optimization. And I think it's really important to not kind of jump ahead on any of those things, because I think the tendency when you're kind of a C-suite coming in trying to make a change at a company is I'm going to go right to optimize, right? Like I'm going to jump in and do that. And I think the key is really about what you're trying to do is put, like, you kind of have to understand the data and kind of see where is it messy, what needs to be cleaned up. And one of them is item properties, right? I mean, we've seen, and this is not like a hard thing to understand, but cost in fulfillment, in small parcel fulfillment especially, is driven by weight and dimensions, right? Pretty much that's it as far as cost goes. There's a couple other, like, does it have lithium ion? Is it, a couple
so
things
can explode
like that.
in the plane, right?
Yeah, right. All that, so there's a couple things going on there. But in general, it's weight and dimensions even kind of honestly less so. And that's because the reason that we're there is because that's what's driving costs, right? It's like, this is how many things I can put on my truck, and this is what, and so I think, you kind of start with, like, I need to figure out I need to have all of this data if I'm going to start making an accurate estimate of what carrier I should pick and what it's going to cost me. And that's important. I think the other thing but on the other side, it kind of becomes, like, I'll just give you another example, kind of this measure, automate, optimize thing, which is just that on the carrier side, Amazon was probably early on, what we started doing is just measuring carrier performance, right? And this whole concept of we called it delivery estimate accuracy and DEA. And I would say DEA was one of the anchor metrics that drove operations for almost the entire time I was there, right? This notion of if I decide it's going to get there by Friday, how accurate am I with that? And I better as hell be in the high 90s on that, right? It's extremely important that what you promise people, you're going to deliver on. And I'm going to start measuring and tracking that. And so the example is, though, I figure out DEA, and that puts me in a position to now say, well, now I have a model of how fast carriers are going. Why, I can promise off that. That's the automation state. Right. But now I can optimize and say, like, I'm going to pay for ground shipping and know that it's going to get there in 2 days. Right. And these types of insights, like having access to kind of understanding what the carrier performance actually is and kind of using that as a tool in your tool belt, that was kind of critical to what eventually became the engine that powers Prime. This thinking and the way this was approached. So.
And again, I think you also, and again, to kind of come back into that in a slightly different way, to kind of come back and tease you up through the growth of your career and kind of what you developed at Amazon is, you talk about the data, right? So obviously data is key. You've got the e-commerce data. So you've got a front end e-commerce platform that's selling a bunch of stuff. So you kind of know what the demand equation is, right? So then all of a sudden you say, okay, well, I'm going to move stuff from A to B. I need to know the weights and the dimensions. That's the key data element, right? And really it's weight at the end of the day. What am I moving?
Right.
So inherent in the question and simplifying, paying down to the core blocks, it's one thing you had asset data structured at the forefront so you could organize it and make it searchable in the e-commerce experience, right? That's one piece of set of data. Secondarily, as you started getting logistics, you realized, oh shit, I need to know the weights and the dimensions. Otherwise, all this logistics stuff is going to get honky, weird, right? Yeah. So you kind of started to begin to focus on that. So my question is, as you began to develop within Amazon these insights, you then further began to influence, I guess, downstream to the manufacturers to say, I need this data out of you, because they probably didn't, ironically, have it at the beginning, right? And you're asking questions that no one had really asked before, which is, if I'm going to automate this using technology, well, the asset data is the key element, right? We're in a digital world, we're in a virtual world, right? You got the physical stuff down, but I'm trying to kind of digitally twin now, right? Yeah. This whole kind of experience. And you kind of did it knowingly or unknowingly, very methodically, from the selling point, moved back into the logistics point and uncovered what are the key elements of data I need to know to make logistics work.
Right.
And so my question is kind of inherently in that. How do you view that experience now looking back on that? Because you didn't realize, I don't think, at the beginning, like, oh shit, we're automating logistics into a global sense by using this digital twin methodology. These are all terms we now know today. You didn't know it at the time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, that's interesting.
I didn't have a digital twin concept 18 years ago.
Yeah. And maybe one of the other interesting things that my recommendation to people when they talk about, where do I get this data, right? I will typically say, get it from anywhere you can. Get it from anywhere and everywhere. You're absolutely right. We did ask manufacturers, can you send us this, right? But you also, you want to use signals wherever you can to basically feed this back into the system. And that might mean, UPS charged us more than we thought this would cost, right? I understand, I've modeled out what this package should have cost to ship it there. We, in the fulfillment center, having this concept of like when a box is ready to get its label put on it, how much does the system think it's going to weigh versus how much does it actually weigh, right? And potentially you kick it out and redo it. But it's all about like continually finding these places to measure. And I think if you're not kind of doing that consciously and trying to get supplier, give me your data, customer, tell me when something's wrong and this doesn't make sense, UPS, tell me in the fulfillment center when I actually physically have the thing, feed this back. And then I'm kind of constantly building this model that's saying, this is what it actually is. I know I've shipped this a couple times and I'm accurate with this. And then that data ultimately informs kind of what's happening upstream. And, I think though that was in those years, we didn't have the compute power and we didn't have the kind of formalization around what you would call machine learning and whatnot. But the interesting thing about supply chain and logistics and operations is it's just such a perfect playground for machine learning, right?
Oh my God.
It works so well with those big kind of data science-y problems, because I think it has to do with the fact that the objective is kind of inherently very clear, right? And if you know me well, you know that I'm like pretty cynical on the AI thing in general, just because I kind of like, if you play with your Siri or Alexa, you're like, I don't know, it seems like it's going to be a while before this is going to take over the world. But you know, in terms of these problems with very defined, like large amounts of data, clear output on the other side, clear objective function, it works really well. I have a lot of faith in your ability to do a much better job optimizing than, you know, a human mind can, just because of what it's trying to accomplish and kind of the goal and objective there. But no, I think you're right that, but at a high level, if I kind of back up a little bit, I think what we were really doing in those early days in the fulfillment center is you were setting the groundwork, setting kind of the laying the groundwork to be able to build these processes and collect the right information such that you could start going upstream on the supply chain and actually, you know, building out these more complex processes that ultimately led to Prime, which we can talk to in a little bit.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think that's a great lead into that, right? So now kind of begin to arc forward a little bit. So, you know, you kind of get in, you're doing logistics, you're building this thing. You know, it's almost like it's funny enough to say in 99, the world was just getting used to e-commerce. You guys were already the step ahead, which was trying to digitize logistics, right? That's why I was kind of asking the question is the world saw Amazon transfer from books to e-commerce. Underneath the covers, you were building a logistics platform predicated on a new data model that people hadn't seen before. And the real transformative problem you were solving was, okay, manufacturers, you got to start digitizing data about your assets, create complete asset records, and we got to figure out a way to feed that into system. Otherwise, all the machine learning you're talking about, that's useless if I don't have good data. Right. I mean, that's cool and all. I mean, I'm with you on the AI thing. We can spend a whole nother time talking about that. But you know, as far as just a straight up algorithm, you know, that's just a computational calculation, these massive data sets that should be there that aren't. So you had to solve for that. You had to begin to do the hard work of cleaning the garage, of labeling everything. You had to create a Dewey Decimal System that no one had used before, right? And unique identifiers. And so the data scientists who developed this stuff, I'm not sure they're getting the credit they deserve, but they solved a major issue. And it's still an issue today. This is still the major problem that it prevents the automation, in my opinion, of supply chain, is this sheer lack of quality data around the assets.
And I think
that still persists today.
That's right. It manifests itself as rules, right? Like that's the kind of that's where these things show up. And we talk a lot about Shipium, kind of this concept of like rule sets and using rules versus kind of really trying to take in high quality data, pull in real data and turn it into an optimization. And there's a distinction there. There's a kind of a jump that has to happen. You know, well, before we go onto the supply chain deeper, I'll take one little quick side route where I was on the team that launched Fulfilled by Amazon 2008 and 2009. And the funny thing is that we were really trying to make Amazon's marketplace competitive with eBay. Right. It's kind of funny to think back now. Right. But you know, the marketplace for Amazon was dominated by used books at that point. And FBA, the concept was, let's use the physical assets.
God, that was
Amazon
2008. I'm sorry. Hold on before you go further, because that's a 10-year gap. And again, like you and I probably, you know, don't think about this, but someone listening to this, because that's a big leap to go from, you know, eBay was still, God, I didn't remember this, man. You're triggering something for me here, which is in 2008, 2009, eBay was still the king of the e-commerce, you know,
king of the marketplace. Yes,
at that time, right? And Amazon was still selling books, for God's sakes. That was 2007, 2008.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So now you're kind of in this, like, you were right at the beginning of that flip to where Amazon in the 2010s and forward and just dominated e-commerce, right? And relegated eBay to what it is now, which is just the world's largest used market, which is fine.
Right.
But, you know, it's not the e-commerce giant it once was. So that's That's actually an amazing period to go through. So sorry, because that's like I wasn't even thinking that.
Kind of weird to think that it wasn't that long. Yeah, we didn't have the iPhone was just launching, and
oh my God.
eBay was still kind of this dominant force, and that's an example of you kind of put this tool in place. That what eventually happened is it shifted from resellers to obviously manufacturers selling through FBA, and that's been a huge thing for Amazon Prime. Obviously, again, the customer experience is what pulled that forward, but pretty amazing from the standpoint of just the kind of getting rid of the middleman, right? Like the disintermediation of all this stuff that happened as FBA kind of started to grow over those years. But I would say my biggest accomplishment at Amazon was 2010 to 2016, and this was really the kind of the thinking or the mindset that ultimately led to Shipium, right? And what we were doing in around 2008. We launched this Prime program, and I think it was kind of an internal. It had, I think, people were lukewarm on it, right? When it first came out, it was just the thought was, who is going to buy a subscription thing for faster shipping, right? It seemed very weird, right?
And at the time.
So at the time, but this is an example though of good data, right? And not totally right in the supply chain space, but we started looking at this data, and it was just unbelievable how once a person had this trigger event where they bought Prime, right? They bought a ton more, right? And I think the public quote these days is Prime members buy 4 times more than non-Prime members. So that's, you can read that on a Google for it, and that's what you'll get.
Sure.
I remember it almost being higher than that, but even 4 times amount, like if you're Amazon, the obvious move at that point is, if I can get a customer to buy 4 times as much more, what are you going to do? Well, get them to sign up for Prime, right? So Prime became effectively the growth lever for Amazon in those, around 2009 or 2010. And I think my kind of where I fit into this journey was, I see you're looking around. You're
no, because you got me thinking about that. You got me thinking about the psychology of Prime, right? Which is again a nugget that I think you're kind of going over. Yeah. And inside of there is like a business case study here for MBAs of the latter part of the decade, which is you removed a barrier around shipping costs psychologically, so that the Prime, and this is my own words here, the Prime members didn't think about shipping costs. So unconsciously, purchasers were used to kind of the current airplane model, right? Which is I buy my ticket, then I buy an extra seat, then I buy my extra bag, and people freaking hate that. And we can see that playing out, because now what's happening is, in a pricing model kind of debate, you're going to see the flip back around to fixed prices for all inclusive, because people don't like that piecemeal. I mean, at the end of the day, some do, some don't, but the vast majority, I want to pay one thing, not think about it, get it done, on top of which you made it efficient. So my question here is, and maybe you haven't thought about it, is psychologically, I think you also touched on something that's super important, which is you kind of just remove the whole concept of shipping fees, right? And that just changed the buying behavior. Like I'm not even sure we even know why that is still. Like, I mean, that's the kind of psychologist in me wanting to kind of dig in and go like, geez, why did people, what made that happen?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's definitely this factor of like, I've already paid for something, so I want to use it. So there's certainly that. I think the thing I really think retail is very, very much there's kind of 3 things, right? And this is not, I'm about to just share something I'm Captain Obvious right now, but it's pricing, selection, and convenience. And this is all like back to kind of Sam Walton type stuff. And, it's been discussed for a while and probably even way before that. I don't even, I'm not even entirely sure where this came from, but pricing, selection, and convenience. And clearly, like, the internet had kind of changed the way we think about selection. So, I mean, the eCommerce had, and that's cool. And pricing, the other kind of interesting thing that I wasn't so involved in, but having this essentially everyone showing their prices online, you kind of ended up in the spot where everyone entered into this Cold War where you're just kind of matching prices with everyone else, right? And that's interesting, but what it did is it kind of like canceled out the pricing component. It kind of just said like, wherever I buy this, it's gonna be the same price. So in my internal calculation, I'm not really needing to even think about that, because I know and that was Amazon's goal in doing this, right? It was all about like, I don't want you to even have to think about this. I want you to just be able to get on there. But the convenience thing, once you kind of go from that 3 to 5 days and you take it down to 2 days, right? Well, if you're now, the internal calculus in someone's head is just like, I can go to the mall and dick around with this all day, or I can just like push a and I'll just get it in 2 days. Well, people, the way people think about this stuff is it's not like a black and white thing. There's not single things that matter. It's, it really is like, is this what I want? And then I'm trying to figure out, like, I have to drive to the store, but now I can just get it in 2 days anyway. So I have to drive to the store, even though I might not get it for a little while longer. And so you kind of put all that together and you end up with this really potent formula for a customer experience that just starts triggering this increased usage. Right. And I think what it ultimately did, another good framing is just, it kind of brought, there was this level of item, if you think about the world as kind of hierarchy of needs, there's like the obscure part when your AC unit breaks that you need once every 3 years, and you're fine if that takes a little while to get here, and then there's, on the other end, there's like, food and grocery that you obviously need now and you need to eat, because everyone needs to eat. But these, all of these, like, it brought like the toothpaste and the shampoo and all these kind of things into light that people started feeling comfortable buying online, and Prime was kind of this trigger for it. And that was a huge thing for Amazon as that all started to pick up. Right. But my kind of role in this, just trying to tie it back a little bit to the other stuff, was as we launched Prime, it was very clear that this was an expensive proposition to get people stuff in 2 days, and you have the subscription cost, but it was not going to be enough to offset it. And so when I took over the supply chain in 2010, we kind of saw it as our mission to, how do you actually bring this cost down to the point that this is a sustainable business? Because you ultimately, in kind of Amazon style, you want the thing to be sustainable, even if without the subscription fee, right? I mean, and ultimately, and the way Bezos saw the world is, I'm going to take that and eventually leverage it to make Prime Video and bring more people on the platform and all that other stuff. But and what it ended up being is, it really was this, let's measure where we are with all these different pieces. And that includes like positioning of inventory, what you're telling customers, how you're routing orders and managing kind of inventory flow through the network and drain of inventory in the fulfillment centers, and which carrier we're using and how they're performing. And we're going to measure all of that. And then we're going to start building automation. So we're going to build a forecast and take the forecast and then apply that to the buying process. And then we're going to, kind of going through these different stages, and then the automation, once that's in place, now you're in a position to start optimizing this stuff. And then you start pulling billions of dollars out of this machine, because you've got a great customer experience to anchor on, and you've got all of the tools in place now to take this data and apply it in such a way that you're going to get this as close to optimal as possible, and the cost structure just starts plummeting, right? I mean, it goes down and down and down because you're doing this correctly, right? And that, I think one of the things that is tricky in e-commerce that people don't realize is that 2/3 of the cost of fulfilling an item is really the transportation cost, right? So if you're a, there's the kind of like the picking, sorting it through the building, putting it in a box, closing the box, putting a label on it, getting it ready to go, putting it in the truck. That stuff's like about 1/3 of the cost, or 1/4 of the cost, depending on the dynamics of the item. And then the rest of it is this transportation cost. So if you're going to really optimize how you run your e-commerce business, it's all about getting those decision points right to that supply chain. And then you end up, and then both things come faster, cheaper, all the goodness starts happening. and people buy more, and then everyone's happy, right? So that's kind of the cycle.
Well, and again, I kind of go back to what we've touched on a little bit. If I break down very simply kind of the 3 steps of this whole kind of manufacturing sales process and really at the end of the day, and you kind of went over it, is, there's price point, which is what the consumer sees and what they buy. Well, the e-commerce platforms have kind of level set that, right? Mm-hmm. So that price is no longer really a discussion. You've actually created a true global marketplace, and prices are going to normalize, just like, Keynes and all the economists envisioned hundreds of years ago, but it's actually happening now, right? A true fluid, true macro, economic environment where you can see these things kind of begin to normalize, right? So we've removed that equation. And then secondarily, you come in and say, okay, because where I'm headed with this is, it's not about price. What we're really competing on is margin. That's always what I like to kind of point out to people, right? Like, if you're going to get into this game, what you're really competing on is margin, right? Because your price is kind of going to be fixed by the market, right? And that kind of game's done. So you're really going to optimize your margin dollars. And one of the biggest margin or non-accretive margin, or whatever, negative margin, is in the logistics side, because manufacturing, you're not there yet. Right? We don't have global manufacturing. We don't have 3D manufacturing. We don't have manufacturing. That's kind of what your unit contract manufacturers try to do, is kind of bring that kind of platform perspective. But I'm going to leave that aside for a second, because that's its own animal. But in the middle here, you're basically creating a universal kind of, hey, everybody, e-commerce has been solved by this front end. And by the way, we have a logistics platform that now allows you to compete at the lowest or biggest margin opportunity, because you're not going to be able to repeat this on yourself, and you're constantly optimizing that. And by having that first mover advantage and all that data, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Exactly. Right? You get smarter, better, faster. Right. Right.
It totally is one of those things that just, the more kind of things go through it, the more scale is kind of the way that you put it. If you're an investor, you get scale into that system, and the only way to take on that scale efficiently, though, is with the technology, right? Like that's the amazing thing about data science and the use of it. Is it's not that any one of those individual decisions, someone could figure them out, but it's just that being able to do it at that scale, you need the computers constantly processing and updating this stuff. And so that's really what you're setting up. You're getting your data model right. You automate these processes so that they can be done entirely by a computer, and then you start optimizing the hell out of it. And that kind of cycle is just amazing. Right.
And so that leads right into, I guess, you launching Shipium. You're saying, okay, I've done this now. I've actually grown this. I've tackled this problem to an extent for Amazon specifically, but everyone else should be able to compete and not have the Faustian agreement with Bezos in signing up, because it used to be the same thing at Walmart, right? I mean, I pitched once long ago to Walmart down in Bentonville or wherever the hell they are. And that was a crash course in that was the offline version of Amazon. You go in there, you pay homage to, Walmart, hoping your product and SKU gets picked up. But you are a cog in their machine. They're so down to sign. And by the way, they could immediately go, oh, I love that product, I'm going to take it over myself, as we see with Amazon Basics today. So kind of my point in all this is, there's an opportunity because, Amazon is actually competing. It's cannibalizing its own manufacturers to an extent, right? And everyone knows that. So there's a huge space to say, okay, well, I don't really want to go sign up with Amazon. How do I then compete? Well, there's Shipium. So
I think exactly, and I think the observation and what was the origin story for Shipium was just, if you've done this for several years, you just know how much money structurally is in making good decisions through these different points in the supply chain. And Shipium, the concept was just really pretty simple. There's one other aspect which is a little more nuanced, but the point is that shipping is a revenue driver for e-commerce businesses, right? Yeah. And in order to do fast shipping, you need the tools to actually optimize and run this efficiently, because you cannot decouple speed and cost in e-commerce. It's just they're so connected in terms of of like, if you don't think about both, you're kind of doing both a disservice. And I think, you're kind of fooling yourself if you're using, these 10-day slow truck delivery methods, right? To that you've got an efficient cost structure. And on the flip side, if you're paying for overnight because you've got insane margins on whatever product that you're selling, you're also fooling yourself. So it's kind of it's about thinking about doing that whole thing, solving that puzzle efficiently. But Shipium, the concept is, help people make these decisions in the supply chain to optimize cost and speed, and then also give them the tools to tell the customers about it, because that's what ultimately is going to translate to the revenue. So it's to some degree, it's about actually optimizing these decisions and then allowing you to merchandise them, because merchandising is what's going to actually make the LTV happen and the growth and the sale. And so I just, we started Shipium because we just saw this huge opportunity to tie all this together, and in a way that ultimately is what these customers need. I think to some degree you were touching on a bit, but Amazon, they own, I think, I want to say like 55% of the e-commerce market at this point, something like that. And I just think it's inevitable that everyone starts, as e-commerce grows as a percentage of retail, it is just a foregone conclusion that there's going to be continued pressure on breaking away at that. There's going to be less opportunity for Amazon to subsidize it with other, AWS or whatever aspects of their business. And I think you've got this huge opportunity emerging where more and more players are going to enter into this. And they already are, obviously, but they're going to enter into it in a more direct way, where they're trying to compete on shipping experience. And that's what Shipium is trying to solve. We are really trying to bring this as a tool for customers to grow their revenue, right? Companies to grow their revenue by having an awesome premium shipping experience. The name Shipium kind of came from that, premium shipping. So I mean, hey, there you go. All right. Well, there's even the origin story on Shipium. Sometimes it can be a Yahoo or a Google, which is like nonsensical, but yours is actually like someone thought about somewhere in some, you're having a whiskey somewhere, like, oh my God, Shipium, like premium shipping. But so let me, and I also want to be conscious of time. And like I told you at the beginning, I knew the two of us were going to have a hard time constraining ourselves to an hour. So it's fabulous. But the one thing I want to get into is a little bit of a prognostication kind of view, which is, okay, so now you're in, logistics is still big. There's still a massive amount of technology, data cleansing that needs to happen. There's a lot of connective tissue that needs to be developed between, the freight carriers in ocean, air, land, rail, trucks, and then even last mile kind of shit. I mean, there's a lot of pieces that are coming together that you're still building. I get all that. I want to look forward a little bit, because you've forgotten more about logistics than most people are going to learn in their lifetime. But as we look forward, I also think, and the question for you is, I think there's some disruptors on the horizon for what we consider to be traditional logistics, right? So manufacturing is going through its own kind of rethinking right now, right? We had centralized manufacturing. Now we got regional manufacturing. Again, that's a whole nother episode we could talk about. So let's just assume now, but products, right? And where they are, and if I can pre-position them in a way that's closer to my cohort of users, I mean, things of that nature are starting to creep in to logistics. And I do think there's a couple things I'm sort of trying to tease here, but I think there's a couple things on the horizon also. And I'm thinking kind of along the lines of like drones or 3D printing that are actually still very embryonic. We're still probably 5 to 7 to 8 years from them coming in and really doing the disruption. But if you're not paying attention to them, you're going to miss that as it comes up. So the question is, like, what do you see disruptively in the next 5 to 7 years that you've got your eye on that may or may not be a part of kind of this, disruption that's going to happen? Yeah. I think, the way I kind of tend to frame it is will the disruption have a outsized impact on customer experience in some way? Right. And then it probably secondly, the second checkpoint is, does it have some outsized impact on cost structure? Right. Because if those two things happen, then I think you have this kind of change in the way that you have this massive shift that's going to happen. Right. And I think you're kind of queuing up, like, the interesting thing about the drone or the self-driving car or the kind of those things, right? Is that they potentially just make these processes that, I think like we've kind of seen the grocery delivery, the super fast grocery delivery, and people are struggling with that right now. And they're interesting. They kind of check the first box. They're like, okay, people like this, right? Like they like that they can get stuff in 15 minutes, but they haven't made the cost structure work for it yet. Right. And that's kind of the challenge. And I think, where there's opportunity with some of this stuff is, can you make that cost structure work if you're able to change the dynamics of the way this goes? And I think, the drones, I think, are interesting to everyone because it's not going to work for, obviously it's not going to change like a long haul or density of route or anything that kind of we use as these traditional points. But if drones get cheap enough, they've got enough delivery distance, and these hyper local things are like, okay, I no longer have to kind of hire this Uber-like driver to go deliver one item, which it's just, if you think about the cost of someone going to a store, going to a place, picking it up, driving it somewhere, considering that you have these 15-minute time events, like you're not going to get more than 2 items. 2 items is going to be a stretch. And so I can't in my head make that math work, right? But if you did have something where the capitalization on a drone was cheap enough, and I think that's why it's interesting, and you kind of keep playing with it, is that's an opportunity for doing like these hour deliveries or these kind of changing that dynamic. And so I think that's interesting. I think I do think there's probably quite a bit of, I think you can, if you follow this pattern of kind of continued disintermediation and this notion of kind of disintermediation / globalization. And obviously we go back and forth around the obviously like supply chain. There's a huge win by shifting all of the manufacturing to China. And now there's kind of, now we're over invested in that. And but I think in general, this notion of trying to find efficient ways to balance. If you think of the world as what does it cost to make it versus what does it cost to kind of move it near a person where they're going to purchase it in the e-commerce world. I think there's a lot of interesting things in forms of this 3D printing or automation or something else, such that if I'm able to bring, like it's inherently much, much cheaper to make a couch in China, right? But it costs a lot to ship the couch across the US. And so to the US. And so therefore the calculus is not as simple as like 1,000 USB drives. Right. And so I think, I think the reason that the 3D printing stuff is interesting is just, if I've got more or less automated or more cost efficient ways to make it locally, then, and it's on par with what it costs to, maybe not even as low, but close when you factor in the capitalization, then you're in a position to say like, okay, well, if I can make it for relatively cheap, I don't have to ship it across, right? Or I can ship it on demand. And I think all that stuff is very interesting on the horizon as these things start to take hold. And I think you're seeing it. I think you see the beginnings of it now, because you've got different people playing with different models based on what's the customer want, and then what are the realities of kind of the cost of manufacturing and supply and everything else, right? So I think all of that is super. I think it's definitely going to go in a different direction over the next 10 years, and it's hard to see exactly what works. There's people that are much further out ahead, looking at all this stuff, but super interesting. For sure. All right.
So I'll wind up, and I know we're kind of coming to top of the hour here. But I do want to ask, and first of all, I also want to congratulate you, because it kind of flew over it. You guys closed an A round, pretty good size a few months ago.
Appreciate it.
That's obviously, a Herculean task in the midst of everything, but you're also, I think, candidly in a pretty solid space. If people weren't throwing money at you, then they're kind of missing the boat. You know what I'm saying? Like it's the biggest thing. I mean, I like to look at what's going on here, the digitization of this $100 trillion economy, as the biggest thing to actually emerge as an opportunity since the internet itself. It's like, For me, all these 25 some odd years, 30 years have been kind of leading up to the digitization of the world supply chain in a way, right? We've kind of been dancing around it. We're kind of getting back into it. So question is, got some money, super exciting, great times. What's coming up for you guys like this year into next year? Like what are you guys doing? What's sort of the announceable stuff that you guys, because it's obviously a pretty fun time to be where you're at, I imagine.
Yeah. I mean, I think we are, I think, you in these, we've kind of landed on, I think when we started Shipium, we were playing around with, should we get some warehouses? Should we try to do operations? But I think the need has been very, very clear that this software model is a really good fit for us, because it allows us to really, the argument is just that it's going to be hard for retailers up to the size of Amazon to go build all this stuff. It's a heavy lift. Totally. And so if we can build it, then we should be able to provide it as a service, and the SaaS model really fits well. But I think we're basically we have several customers on the platform now. They're running the software, and I think you've got so if I think about like what's the goal, I think definitely more volume to the system, because it improves our data modeling, improves our ability to kind of help with decisions. And so clearly, like booking new contracts, growing customers, helping with all those things are at front and center of what we're trying to do. And then I think the other kind of angle of that is just focusing on continuing to build out this platform. I think what we found is that the reason Shipium is compelling to people, and the reason it's interesting, is if you look at every individual piece that comprises the platform and what we're doing, there probably is something out there that is competitive with us. I think the intriguing part when we're selling to people is just the concept of this coordination and tie together. So we're really trying to do is kind of anchor ourselves on this horizontal piece where all of those different factors are talking together really well. And you get this outsized advantage the same way we did at Amazon effectively of things being coordinated and talking in this way, such that, when you're placing inventory, it knows kind of what the transportation cost is at any node, or if I'm going to make a decision on improving my kind of how fast I want to ship or my promises, I understand the shipping cost such that I can make that trade-off between speed and cost very efficiently, and kind of, essentially it's equivalent to like ad spending optimization, right? Yeah. I can dial that up in a way. And so, the more features and the more kind of robust we make the platform, the more compelling it is to future clients, as well as like, people using it for more of their stuff. Right. And so that's that's really the focus. It's still a very engineering heavy company, because it's a heavy lift, but that's what we're trying to do over the next couple of years. So
that's awesome, man. Well, listen, I again just want to thank you for spending some time here this morning. It's such a great story. Definitely going to keep an eye. Virtually we're connected, and I also want to highlight people. You're open to connecting on LinkedIn. You're all over that. Absolutely. There's some great stuff, for you guys if people want to read up on it. But congratulations with the success. Fun to watch. Great conversation. Would love to do it again in some other time. But it's just really thank you a lot for spending some time.
Thank you so much. It was great talking to you, Richard. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for listening. If you have any comments about this episode or topics on supply chain you'd like us to cover, you can reach us at supplychainnext@requis.com. And while you're at it, check out the Requis platform at supplychain.requis.com. Requis allows you to manage the full asset lifecycle in the cloud while collaborating with your entire value network to buy, manage, and sell your assets. Find out more at requis.com.